we get frustrated often with the structure of schools is likely because it's not designed for what we know about human development, human learning. The idea of intelligence being singular and it being fixed is a fundamentally flawed idea. Creativity, similar to intelligence, the work that we've done, asks us to think about it not as an individual activity, but it's a social activity. Remember that human learning is a non-standardized process. Learning is not just this transmissive acquisition of information.
人的潜力从何而来？如何通过教育去激发孩子的潜力？相信是很多家长和老师非常关心的问题。那哈佛大学教育学院的0点项目呢，也一直致力于揭开这个谜团。那0点项目是美国也是世界上教育界持续时间最久、规模最大的研究活动之一，对现代教育产生了深远的影响。那在50多年前呢，项目设立的初衷是对艺术教育进行研究。 而随着时间的推移呢，转为了对人的思维方式和学习方式的深入研究，也持续影响着世界各国的政策制定、理论发展和教学实践。
At Project Zero, the kind of questions that we ask tend to be about, as you said, Carol, what makes us human and how can we understand those facets, like what does it mean to be intelligent? What does it mean to be creative? What does it mean to be ethical? And understand what those mean in different cultural contexts. And then what are the conditions that will enable each of us, all of us, to develop into our fullest potentials. Some of the insights have been quite profound. I mean, so for example, what does it mean to be intelligent is a really interesting question.
无论是在中国还是美国都有人热衷于从小呢就要让孩子去做逻辑题、去测智商，好像孩子IQ 越高，就代表着未来越聪明、越有前途。但0点项目的重要成果之一就是这个多元智能理论，让教育界广泛认识到人类至少具有7种以上的智能。全面的教育应该是开发多元智能，最大限度去发挥孩子的潜能。 而智力和创造力呢，都不是天生固定的，而是可被培养发展。而创造力也可以在与人互动的过程中被激发。
And so for almost 100 years, that was a pervasive view on intelligence. It was also a pervasive view that it was fixed. I mean, if we look at a broad view of what makes us intelligent as a species, certainly there are many symbol systems that we use to solve and find problems. You know, mathematics is a particular symbol system. Language is a particular symbol system. But there are many others. I mean, how we use our bodies, how we engage in different kinds of spatial problems. So the idea of intelligence being singular and it being fixed is a fundamentally flawed idea. But we've also done work around creativity. And the idea of creativity also being thought of as, you know, kind of a singular kind of possession, we should question that. I mean, similar to intelligence, creative acts, I mean, acts that are novel, acts that are almost surprising, need to be viewed in cultural contexts. Creativity, similar to intelligence, the work that we've done, asks us to think about it not as an individual activity, but it's a social activity. Innovation requires us to do things that are surprising, and it requires us to take that risk of not knowing what will happen. They make more mistakes than successes. So the idea of being open to making mistakes, being open to hearing other points of view, into being open to exploring the unknown, I would say these are dispositions. These are ways of seeing the world. Although we might look at, the sort of myth of an innovator as sort of this, courageous, fearless, brave, you have to be vulnerable. You can't be just powerful, bold, and brave without having some relationship to the fear, the unknown, the uncertainty.
So it's quite contrary to, people's view that you are born smart or you are born creative, right? So some of the findings show that a lot of these things are learnable, and you have to put it in specific context. So I think that's quite, like a surprising findings for, modern age.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is important to understand, too, is that many of the ways that we've developed the social institutions of school were designed prior to knowing this information. We get frustrated often with the structure of schools is likely because it's not designed for what we know about human development, human learning, and what we know about the kinds of solutions that students will need to solve either immediately or in an uncertain future.
过去啊，我们对人的智力、认知、学习方式、思维模式啊，这些都不了解。但是我们的教育模式呢，却是建立在这种不了解的情况之上的。所以为什么很多人会在目前的教育中呢，成长感到痛苦？因为它其实不符合人最根本的学习和思维的方式。而且标准化的培养方案和个性化的需求之间也是发生了很大的冲突。但缺乏个性化发展和创新力的培养模式呢，显然又已经无法适应未来的社会需求。And our education system hasn't really changed since for the past 130 years. How should schools or our education system adapt to the needs of the future?
I were to offer a series of kind of goals for us as designers and leaders of schools, I would suggest that we step back and ask ourselves, what do we mean by learning? Because the answer to that question shows us potential solutions for how we could design a school for today and for tomorrow. If we define learning as the process of transmitting information efficiently into the minds of students, then the current forms of school historically work because they're designed for transmission. However, what we know about learning from a psychological standpoint is that's only a small part of the learning process. There's all sorts of other components to learning: trial and error, getting feedback, taking risks, making connections across disciplines and contexts, what we call transfer.
Everyone learns in a different way, everyone's needs are different, as you said, but our education system is set up in a very standardized way. That's the easiest way to measure, that's the easiest way to teach. So how should things be set up differently so that people learn better?
How to change practices is a really challenging pursuit. What we try to do is create environments in which teachers can become learners and experience that complexity and can experience that visibility and frankly can experience, I'm glad you said standardized, can experience the non-standardization of learning. I mean, it's a very important point to remember that human learning is a non-standardized process. We can overlay, standardized metrics, but we have to always remember what we're measuring may not be the whole experience of learning. So it could be some part of it. There's one thing that I want to be very clear on is that at Project Zero, we don't have the answers. We have insights, but the answers will always reside in the local applications and adaptations because locally is where the cultural values and norms play out.
So nothing is replicable per se. You have to explore your own way. I guess the evaluation system is very important because if you don't change the evaluation system, no matter what else you change, people still work towards that direction.
I think rest in very frank explorations of what kind of people do we want to be creating and developing. Do we want both people who know a lot about math and people who can make ethical decisions? I mean, because, ethics, morality, I think these are really important themes for us to consider in this particular moment in the world. Do we want people who can be good communicators? And do we want them to be able to be complex and critical thinkers? In the United States, and I think in other countries, there are more and more universities and colleges who are accepting the fact that things like standardized scores, SAT scores, etc., are only a small piece of information about the quality and caliber of a student's potential. And so opening up different windows into seeing what a student has learned, what their process has been like. The Mastery Transcript Consortium is much like a portfolio approach. That is, we bring pieces of work or our process.
So tracking students' holistic growth in many, many different aspects, I guess, like showing schools and potential employers in the future their portfolio and how they, what kind of skills they have instead of just one-on-one aspect.
It'd be interesting to ask ourselves, as we have grown as adults, what are some of the important kinds of qualities or traits that would make an effective or successful, whether it's professional or citizen. In my own experience, resilience is a really important quality. How do we confront challenges? How do we face adversity? How do we overcome? And how do we engage others in that process? So this idea of resilience is certainly not something we're going to get from a standardized mathematics score.
在当今社会，单打独斗已经无法解决我们面临的各种复杂问题。每个人都需要与他人合作，才能取得长足进步。人们所面临的经济、环境、健康和社会问题都变得更加的棘手。全球面临的严峻挑战，要求我们不能再用单一学科的知识，由单独一个国家、地区或机构组织去解决那些人类面临的重大的问题。必须要由来自不同背景、文化的人、不同机构、组织之间，通过跨学科、跨领域的合作，一起去面对和解决。而成人协助学习也是 Daniel Wilson 的研究方向。他希望通过自己的研究和实践，去帮助创造新的学习方式。And you are the expert on adult collaboration. Could you share some of the findings with us? How do people work together the best, and what are some of the good mechanisms that we can reference?
And collaboration, I think, is a very interesting human activity. It's a really important reminder for leaders or designers to always check whether or not, if we're going to give a challenge or a piece of work to a group or a team, does it really need a group or a team? I've certainly sat on many committees or groups where we had to write a report, and frankly, one person could have written it and probably written it better. So where we see collaboration breaking down often is in that task design. Another criteria is more about human interactions. And one of those is help-seeking behaviors. So how do we ask for and give help and feedback to each other? When there is conflict of ideas, opinions, to focus the conflict on the work and not the people. This idea of visibility is really important because what we've noticed in a lot of team effectiveness is that teams, particularly creative teams, they use artifacts and objects to mediate their interactions. So they might look at sticky notes or have plans, and so when there's disagreements, they can point to the ideas. Oftentimes where things get difficult to manage is when there aren't those objects, and so the only it's only language that is mediating the interaction. And that's where oftentimes we could see some relational conflict.
You work with a lot of global organizations, in developing, humans and developing, their employees, and helping them to learn and grow at the work environment. Could you share some findings with us?
The big finding, I would say, is work should be thought of as learning. When we frame what we do developmentally, we have more opportunities to grow. So when we just view work as an isolated action with no ways for growth, that's when it becomes very, very difficult to spark creativity, to spark innovation, to think about adaptation within organizations. So part of work is that you are building knowledges and skills, and that is woven into how we do our work. So for example, when we do something, after we do it, do we ask for feedback? I mean, that is a very simple step, but that's a learning step. They get that feedback, and then they're held somewhat accountable for acting on that feedback. So the role of a manager is kind of interesting here, because in these companies, the manager becomes more of a learning facilitator. It's asking the workers, what did you learn? What did you learn from the feedback? What could you do to improve? What will you do differently next? And then tracking that development and learning over time.
浮躁的社会啊，让我们总去寻找最快的、最有效的育儿方式。但人的需求、学习方式都是多元化的，人的成长也是一个复杂体系，很难简单被复制。那家长在陪伴过程中以身作则，潜移默化的去影响孩子，其实是最重要的。成功没有捷径，在育儿这条路上啊，也没有捷径。I know nothing is, that simple as to, you can simplify, someone's, growing up experience and trying to replicate it. But, all parents are concerned about, as you said, improving their children's intelligence, improving their children's creativity, developing their children's creativity. Any tips for parents as to, what they can do?
I have a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. I deeply empathize with that challenge. If I have a hobby, if I'm engaged in something that is interesting to me, I should make that very visible to my kids and show them what it means to be an adult and that adults are developing. We are developing. And we can learn new things. We can fail. We can make mistakes. And the more we can model that to our children, the more resilient they're going to be. For example, I'm a musician, I think you know, and from an early age, I always, engaged my kids in playing music. They could see me play. I would talk about mistakes. I would try things out, and that was very intentional. How can we show, not just tell, but show our children what it looks like to learn?
And you're a musician. How has that training inspired your work now? And how does art education really impact children's growing up?
Yeah, well, we always need to remember as parents that arts have been around longer than any other disciplines. It's only been a few hundred years that we've had these sort of formalized disciplines. Going back to some of the basics of, we can look at sort of, philosophy over the last several thousand years about it's important to develop one's body physically. It's important to develop one's mind. It's also important to develop one's ethics and character. And this idea of arts oftentimes cuts across these three. I will caution us against using the arts as evidence towards better performance in other disciplines. We should look at arts for the kind of innate opportunities it gives students.
So a lot of parents say that, of course, I want my children to play, but they're very suspicious of the pedagogy of play because they said they don't want their children to lag behind when they go to the next level.
When we talk about playful learning, we're not talking about frivolity. There are a lot of important aspects of free play on the playground. I mean, there's a lot of things that kind of outside world exploration with air and natural objects. We know that encountering this kind of stimuli can help, particularly in the early years of child development. The idea of playful learning is actually much more serious. I mean, what we mean by that is the experience of playfulness is, and you can see this on playgrounds, but you can see it in how we operate in the world as human beings. Sure, it has some components of joy and fun, but it also has other components where we can take some risks, where we can have some empowerment to make decisions. We can decide what the rules might be, and we can change the rules. I mean, we know learning happens at a deep level when students can feel empowered, when they feel like they can have some ownership, when they feel like they can set direction and goals. And that's part of play. We feel empowered. We feel like we can make some choices and set some goals. So there are some key parts of playfulness that actually are very important to how we learn. And yeah, of course, it should be enjoyable, but not all play is fun all the time. I mean, playfulness can also have moments of frustration and struggle.
近年来啊，我们一直都提倡游戏化学习，其实也是得益于这个项目的研究。那多带孩子到户外自由玩耍呢，可以使孩子有机会去探索和尝试新的东西，面对困难和失败，培养分析解决问题的能力和学会与人交往和处理矛盾冲突，可以帮助他们学习管理不确定性和更好的去应对无法预测的未来。那其实我们人千年以来不就是这样子学习成长的吗？我们需要思考清楚的是，培养孩子的目标是高分升学还是全人成长？即使有哪位家长不想自己的孩子健康幸福呢？只是不要被高分升学这些迷惑了我们的长远目标。What's your vision for future education?
I would like to see education remind itself that what we're aiming to do is not just create the skills for jobs. That is not the goal of education. Education is, I think, a broader social activity of how do we develop humans. In a way, schools are the design solution to a society asking itself, how do we develop humans? I think there are other forms that are developing humans that are outside of schools.